Ooh. This is already liquid caffeine, isn't it? Or is it just like straight? Okay, so everyone get an Express repo booted up. No, it could be in a different folder. Also, fun tip if you aren't doing this already. So you all might find this code more useful beyond this, but you'll come to a time, if you haven't already, where you just want to write code, but you don't particularly care where the file is or for how long the file exists for. So my tip to you is if you go to /temp, the files in there will be periodically cleaned out on your file system. Every now and then the operating system will just go through and delete those. So whenever I just need like a scratch space to work on code that I know for a fact that I'm not going to want to keep, I'll go into temp and make a directory and do stuff in there. Okay, everyone boot it up? Yeah, I just want a blank Express project. So a package.json with Express and Express downloaded node modules. Okay, give everyone a second to catch up. Okay, so let's see what happens now if we get some sort of error for whatever reason. Say if true, x equals y plus z. And here's what happens. It says reference error, y is not defined, life is terrible, so on and so forth. So what happens by default, when you have an error, if you don't do anything else in your app, it's going to behave like, I'll give you a moment to type this in too. Basically what I'm doing is I'm intentionally putting an error in my code such that when I hit that route, it's going to say x equals y plus z. Well, we don't have a variable y, nor do we have a variable z. So that's going to throw an error, throw an error, say y is not defined. You could replace that with any sort of more real world error. Maybe you tried to get in the database and you weren't connected. Maybe you did an AJAX call and you got a bad response. Maybe you typed up a different variable name wrong, whatever. But what typically happens is we'll make this error handling middleware. Which I have to, in order to really make sense of this error handling middleware, I'm going to have to go a little bit lower level on Express with you than I usually would to help make sense of this. So when I think of Express routes, what data structure comes to mind when you think of how Express routes are set up? Does it feel kind of like an object? Does it feel more like an array? What feels right? What is routing doing? We're matching routes with the verb, right? Get slash, post monkeys, put donkeys, whatever, right? And then we have a callback function that takes the request and the response. But what would you describe in JavaScript if you had to, let's say we're making our own Express. It won't be that hard to do, believe it or not. I'm going to make my own Express right now. We're going to say right, then in here we can get back out, return routes, and as we're doing app.get slash, that's going to add an entry here, and it's going to link it to that request response we made down there. When I do post.app.post monkeys, right? I forgot to spell monkeys. So you put it in there, and then it'll go down there, right? But the part that I find unintuitive about this is what would have made sense to me, is if it was an object. When, in fact, under the hood, a lot of this stuff is actually an array. So it's actually going to look like get with a list full of get routes, where one of them is a route where the path is slash, the callback is request response. Let's say we also have another one for get dogs, callback. I promise this is building up to something good too. But basically for each get, put, patch, whatever, we have an array full of objects where one part says, well, which path is this one associated with? Is it associated with just the get route or get dogs? And it maps the callback to it. The reason why this is important and profound that we have an array here and not an object is that there are multiple possible matches for a path at times. And you could do stupid stuff in Express like this. which would not be possible if Express used an object instead. And you kind of have to get this in order for error handling to make sense. Where we can actually make two different handlers for the slash routes. Personally, the way that I would have expected this to work is I would have expected this to be doing a mapping, a one-to-one mapping, and oh, when I do this one, it's going to overwrite the option for that one. Not so. The way this is actually going to look, taking a peek at our Ghetto Express up here, is it's going to look something like this. We're going to have two entries in there for slash. And whenever you do a lookup, Express is going to iterate over all your declared routes looking for the first match. Well, what's the first match going to be? This one. The first one we declared in. Meaning, when we run this, and when we run it, this one is actually going to block this one because it does that order checking. Yes?
When you do app.get, it's pushing that to an array?
Basically.
Okay.
Yeah, it's basically pushing that to an array. And I've even helped, I don't remember who it was, but I've helped at least 2 or 3 of you with a bug like this where you've accidentally declared the same route more than once, and then the code wasn't triggering. So this can happen. Anywho, the way this connects to error handling middleware is app.use. How does app.use work? What's the path for app.use?
Everything that comes to it.
Everything that comes to it. So that means if we were to put this up here, what's going to happen? Does every single path match this? Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. So that means when Express checks that routes array, which you can read the Express code at this point and see it do it. It literally looks through an array of routes. It's going to find this guy first. Express just goes through and looks for a potential match for the path. This matches every path. Meaning if you put it at the beginning, it's going to match everything. Right? A way that you can... Another way to look at app.use is you can look at it like this. App.all verbs, any route. This is invalid syntax, by the way, but this is fundamental to app.use. App.any verb, all possible routes. Is every single request going to match this one?
Yes.
Yes, it will, meaning our error handling will get triggered every single time. That's why it's important that we put our error handling middleware at the bottom down here. Because what's happening in most cases is this is basically a bunch of code where you can look at your app like a giant switch statement or a giant if-else, and this is just your final be-all, end-all else, where if it can't match any of these other routes, or if anything goes wrong, it's going to go down to here. Right? This is also patched on next, such that if we call next anywhere, it's going to bring us down to there. Okay. Any questions so far?
When it's reading through, it comes to the first route and it likes it, and then later on you have use. It's not going to get to that use.
So it looks through the list of routes for the first route that can fulfill that path and that verb. There might be multiple ones that can fulfill it, but it's going to look for the first one. That's why the ordering of these routes matters. That's why this one right here needs to actually be last. In fact, I almost wonder, let's see. If I can't find this really fast, I'm going to back out of this idea, but I wonder if I can find the bit of code real quick. let's see, there's the route handles method. Oh yeah, here it is. There's the stack full of routes that it has. And it's actually going to, this part where it goes through it. Oh yeah, methods for each, iterates over each one, checking it. I think there's the part where it is right now. I don't look at the Express source code every day. But I believe that's the part where it's checking over each of the methods, going through all the routes and seeing it. And that was inside the router file of Express. Okay, so you got to put this down at the bottom. For that reason, is that part clear? All right, so what I want you to do now is articulate to a table member what happens if we put the Express error handling middleware at the top versus if we put it at the bottom, and why does that order matter? In your own words. 1 minute.
It comes to the top and he gets it first. Does it first. My question is, that's why we put the error handling stuff.
Your error handling middleware.
So as soon as it's the use when it runs that and says not done. But if it runs get first, then it'll be also be done. So it'll never use only gets to this. It's at the bottom. It's the last.
Okay, so next thing I want to show you is why a lot of you aren't getting very good error handling in Express. Because a lot of you, you go help out your app and there's like no real information. We had to debug to see it. Well, there is implicitly an error handling middleware that Express puts on there for you. That's what was doing the original why not defined. But if we put our own one in there, that one actually won't be called. So for example, let's just say I do in error, something like that. Go back in here and say, if true, let x equals y plus z. Nothing. We didn't actually get any meaningful errors there. Where without that, let's see what happens if I take off this bottom bit right here. Now we're saying error messages here and over here. So there's two options for this. One is if we call next down here at the bottom, that error handling middleware is still there. We've just added ours in front of it. That's the built-in default error handling middleware is the one final one that you cannot really change unless you were to like really monkey around with internal bits of the library that you shouldn't. Otherwise, it's always going to put yours in front of that very end one. But it's still actually there. Meaning, if we call next with error inside of it, it's actually going to go into that default middleware handler, which is going to give us that nice stack trace that we're used to from before. Another option is you can add a little bit more of that niceness back to your own error handling middleware instead. So instead of just console.logging in error, I could say, well, actually log out that error. And I can pass that along the line too, if I wanted to. And now we're getting that again. Because by default, that error object is going to be, at least in this case, a stack trace of what happened. So does everyone see why you weren't getting any error messages during a lot of your apps? Right? Because most of you had something like this. Right? There's no login. This error object is actually not JSON, so it can't really be handled over the wire properly.
And the correct way to do it, you head next, right, I think, without a return.
Yeah, so there are two ways to handle it. You can either call next yet again to pass that along further,
Right.
or you could do that, or if you're using Morgan or something, you could like Morgan log that out there. What I would suggest, the most likely thing that's going to happen in your actual on-the-job stuff is you're probably not going to use the default console.log for a production app. You're probably going to use something like Morgan or Long John or one of those other ones. What's the most likely thing that's going to happen is you're going to delegate to that logger inside of here. Make responsible for, hand off to.
And I would like write the error to some file that you
Exactly. Or even more fancy, you might have some sort of check in here where if you're in production mode, log out to a file using Morgan or Long John or whatever. Or if you're in development mode, then write to the console. Things like that. Okay. And I think that should more or less take care of all the confusions around error handling. Oh, one more actually. But first, questions. Yeah.
So if you have errors that you want to throw, let's say like somebody for the Poke API, if we were rewriting that, and somebody put in like the ID of a Pokemon that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that would you would want that to throw some kind of like 404 error. Would you just do that within? Would you handle that error within the route itself, or would you try to like pass something along to an error handler and have that take care of it?
The correct way to do so is to pass it along, let the error handle it. I sometimes feel a little skeptical with that approach. I like handling errors where they happen. But the typical way to do it is you might have multiple error handling middlewares down at the bottom, where this one can be for unfound Pokemon, and this can be a catch-all error, pun intended. And what we can do inside of here is we can say, because let's say that let's have, I don't want to wrap this out. I'll make a fake Pokemon API real quick. Get Pokemon /ID. Could do something like if rec.param, actually this, if ID is less than 0, or ID is, how many of these guys are there now?
Like 700 or 800.
Over 9,000, I don't know. Right, if we're out of bounds at some case, we could do something like next
So you would actually create an error object and you would pass that into the next function there.
Yeah, and then what we could do in here is we can say if, I forget the property, I think it's message. I have to double check the property. right? Well, what we can do is if we could do specific handling with regards to this error. You know, maybe we can say, kind of cheesy, but if something we could say, oh, we're going to create new ones or not, whatever. Otherwise, we can go down here, and that's going to go down to our catch-all line, right? A real-world example for this is you might break it down based on types of errors. You might say, oh, this is an error related to, well, you're an API. Your API is probably going to talk to other APIs. Those other APIs might have issues. So one might be, oh, HTTP AJAX call errors. One might be file system errors in your ends, right? Different apps will get different levels of granularity. So something that is common is to have like a sequence of error handling middleware for more specific stuff, right? And it goes from more specific to more general, and we just pass along until we find the one that ends it, right? You can keep going next until something ends the response. Right.
Does that work with next and then RES rest status afterwards?
So we cannot do both. It's one or the other. Every single express callback here, right? And I'm speaking absolutes here, and I'm speaking absolutes intentionally. Every single express route should either end the response or invoke next. If your express callback does not do either of those two things, you're doing something seriously wrong. You always want to do one or the other.
So this might be a little bit, so I'm just trying to think, how would you, if you had like this express or like even using MVC and different promises out, how would you run debugger to it? Would you have to run it through each one of the phases of the code, or would you?
So if I really wanted to debug this end to end,
Yeah.
I'd have to do something like this. Because the problem being, there's no good way to really do an extra step into an event callback, right? It's far easier because there's lots of code that we can't see that happens between here and here, right? It's going to go into Express's stuff to go through a next and all that. So it's easy. It's usually simpler. Just go down to here and then hit continue to jump ahead to there. Because you could do it. Like I'll show you real quick.
And that would go through all the files, even if you have like a controller file or router file or whatever.
No, let's only go through the ones that we set it to. So I could do Pokemon. We're in here. I could go ahead and step into that call to next, but at this point, look at the file I'm in. I'm in Node Modules, Express, Lib Router, Layer.js. Sometimes it is useful to step through their code to see where something goes wrong, but in general, I don't really want to look at their code. I just want to look at my code. So I'm going to hit C to jump to my next debugger line. Yeah, I could have kept going next and followed that through, but that's not generally what you want, and sometimes, based on what's going on with the event loop, that might not even be possible if it happens on the next tick. Yeah, in terms of MVC, a common way that I've seen this laid out is you might have a lib library or an error handlers library where that might define multiple types of error handlers that we could bring into our index file and then attach on at the end. In general, though, for the purpose of this class, one error handler is going to be sufficient, right? You don't necessarily, just because you can have multiple types of error handlers with different levels of granularity, that doesn't mean that you necessarily need that every time. I would go so far as to say you probably won't need it for any of your stuff here, but it is possible to do. All right, yeah.
On the git route, you don't need to put next up rec res next.
Oh, yeah, I should have next right there.
If you don't, can you still use next in your login?
No, that is incorrect.
And still, I have a question about, in the catch-all,
Yeah.
where you call next and then response, doesn't the next send it off and then it doesn't get to the response?
Yeah. Well, no, this one, that's a bad example. That was from that was left over from the last example where I delegated the default error handling middleware. You're right. You wouldn't want to have both of those. All right. I'm going to call it then. Thank you.